Hello, my name is Dr. Denise Howley, and today I will be talking about the impact of trauma on learning. Some of the materials from the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, some from Basil Vanderkolk, some from Gordon Hodas, and some from my own experience of working with children in schools for the past 30 years. What's important to note is that many children have experienced trauma. Some of the data indicates almost 70% of children and adolescents have experienced a potential traumatic event by the time they are 16. Of these, 50% have experienced a second event, and more than 20% of these also had school problems, emotional difficulties, as well as physical problems as a result of this trauma. The definition I'll be using today is that trauma is an extreme traumatic stressor involving direct personal experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury or other threat to one's physical integrity, witnessing such an event, or learning about unexpected violent death, serious harm, or threat of these to a family member or close associate. These two slides indicate the impact of toxic stress on the brain. On the left, you see a normal brain with typical neuron with many connections. On the right, you see the impact of toxic stress of damaging these connections. That's important to note because the effects on the brain affect the behavior and the experience of the child. How does trauma look in students that we see? How does it impact them? Basically, learning becomes more difficult with attention regulation. Their short-term memory is impacted. They have high reactivity to failure. They tend to have a reduced responsiveness to their environment, not as clear about what is going on. They have an interference with their perception of reality. They create attention blocks. They can misread important cues. And importantly, their executive functioning is impacted. In addition, it affects their relationships. They need more teacher approval. They have difficulty with affect regulation. They tend to be hypersensitive. And that results in a self-concept of feeling inferior, inadequate, and lacking confidence. The link between trauma and child development and the effect on physical and emotional health is clear. Children are vulnerable when experiencing trauma. However, the outcomes can depend on a number of situations, such as the age of the child. The younger the child is, the more impactful. The type, severity, duration, chronicity, as we mentioned, repeated traumas are more difficult to manage than a single trauma. Prior vulnerability, as I mentioned, issues of gender, race, poverty can also create more vulnerabilities. The hopeful part is the response of primary caregivers. The calmer and more supportive parent can ameliorate a lot of the effects of trauma being long-lasting. The outcomes can affect every aspect of a child's development and functioning. As we mentioned, brain development, neurochemical pathways, psychosocial adaptation is affected, their ongoing responses to stress, as well as their other life experiences. In general, when we talk about trauma-informed care, we are recognizing first the pervasiveness of trauma, and we are making a commitment to both identify and to address the symptoms early. Understanding the connection between the presenting symptoms and behaviors and trauma history is necessary and essential to being fully trauma-informed, and understanding the intersectionality between different forms of discrimination that can increase a child's vulnerability is also a key part of being trauma-informed. I want to focus on adolescents first. For children between the ages of 12 and 17, they tend to exhibit similar responses to adults. They're internalizing symptoms, emotional numbing, avoidance of stimuli, flashbacks and nightmares, depression, withdrawal, isolation. Somatic complaints is a major one, sleep disturbances. External behaviors include interpersonal conflicts, aggressive responses. School refusal and avoidance is again a major behavior among adolescent students. As we mentioned before, the effects of trauma are cumulative, so past exposure to trauma makes one more vulnerable to new experiences, the more a student's neurobiological system must make adaptations to traumatic situations, the greater chance that these adaptations will endure, which is why issues around poverty, gender, and race, and just systematic systems can make it more difficult for a child to modulate their behaviors and to get past the initial trauma. Students may have limitations of conscious control over their actions. Their memory automatically activates certain responses, and they don't always know what was the trigger, and we as helpers cannot always know. Individuals with post-traumatic stress syndrome are vulnerable to react with irrational, irrelevant, and harmful behaviors that are not always clear to them nor to those of us who are watching it, and they can appear out of place or bizarre. There are certain subtle psychological effects that children who are required to adapt to dangerous and frightening situations tend to develop subtle changes in their thinking and beliefs. And sometimes we can view these as pathological, even though they may have been adaptive in the past. Examples of these is this list. They can be highly guarded, defensive, angry, difficult to redirect, dismiss support even when they need it or want it, can be highly reactive with emotional outbursts to what appear to many of us to be inconsequential events. They have difficulty settling after a difficult situation. They hold grudges. They don't take responsibility, manipulative, over-sexualized, poor boundaries. They seem to make the same mistakes over and over and do not appear to learn from their experience. What's important to note is some of these behaviors may have been adaptive in the beginning. I worked in residential treatment for a number of years and I'm with adolescent girls, and one of their go-to behaviors when faced with stress or difficulty was to leave, to run away, to leave the situation, to leave the program, to go to the streets. This was habitual. In the beginning of when they first started using it, it was a survival skill. But once it became habitual, it was something that they did whenever they felt under stress. So using a trauma-sensitive lens, we need to be aware what are the signs of trauma that a student is displaying, and to help them and us recognize what are the triggers. Example, when we prepare students for things like fire drills or building intruder drills, recognize the need to prepare all students and their guardians ahead of time to plan and prepare. Some people will justify and say, well, when it really happens, they won't have that preparation. But then when it really happens, they will have already had the body memory to have been exposed to the drill, which will help them in the future. The other part we need to pay attention to is a child who is experiencing trauma-reactive behavior may be experiencing traumatic events now. And we need to pay attention to what's going on in school, such as racism, sexism, or bullying, as well as what is going on at home. We do know that reminders of personal trauma can activate brain areas that support intense emotions. And these reminders may not be conscious. It could be a smell, it could be a sound, it could be the way a person looks. But the result is that the energy in all the blood, as we have seen through science, the blood goes straight to the amygdala to fight, flight, or freeze, and it decreases its activity to the prefrontal cortex, which is where our executive functioning is and where we are able to both describe and control our emotions. Trauma can affect that connection. Sometimes I use with students what an author described as, you need to go to your upstairs brain, not your downstairs brain. Your upstairs brain gives you an opportunity to think about the best response. Your downstairs brain is reactivity. Oftentimes it presents for the child that they have trouble with sustained attention and working memory, and therefore they have difficulty being engaged in the present. They can be overwhelmed with their emotions and therefore have difficulty really knowing how their emotions can be an effective guide. I mentioned habitual actions. Chronic problems initiate effective independent action. They could be repeating the same behavior. I mentioned the running away from situations, even though they may now have developed certain skills. It's simply habitual and still needs more practice. Looking at things from a trauma-sensitive lens, we also need to recognize the importance of physical movement. When I would go to a child who had difficulty in school, the first thing I would do is I would take the long walk back to my office, whether that was going outside and around or in some way that they were in movement. It's important for schools to have places or equipment that allow for physical activity. I worked in one elementary school that their OT room, occupational therapy room, was where students went after they had a behavioral challenge, where they could jump on the trampoline or swing on the swings or kick a ball, which would help them move their bodies, which definitely helps with managing the trauma reactivity of fight, flight, or freeze, as that is a physical reaction. Recognizing that school climate and trauma-informed needs to have restorative practices. We need to be a place of teaching, of helping children to manage emotions, to manage behavior, as opposed to simply using a punishment approach. When we talk about Tier 1 or universal supports, these are those things that we want to offer to all students. Flexibility of schedule. Some students can't manage to be rigidly on time, so how can I adjust to that? Teaching social emotional skills. I teach reading, I teach mathematics. Can I teach them how to pay attention to when they are getting angry or anxious? Having teacher and student relationships, or just school staff student relationships, the process of a check-in and check-out. Every morning, can somebody check in with this student to just make sure they're grounded and connected? And in the afternoon, it can check in and say, how was your day? The RTI model of academic and social emotional skill development. If someone doesn't know how to read, I teach them to read. If someone doesn't know how to manage their emotions, I teach them to manage. Having school-based mental health professionals available to students for regular or simply opportunities to check in with students. Family and student support in time of crisis, a death in the family, homelessness, economic downturn. How do we support the family through this? If we can support the family, we will support the student. Teacher training for what to look for and whom to refer and who should they refer them to. And then our general school culture of being a place of learning and acceptance and recognition that we're not all perfect all the time. One of the techniques used for trauma right now is mindfulness practice. And it is something that we have introduced in our schools in many ways through some programs called Calm Classroom or Mindful Schools. The purpose of this practice is to become aware of the ebb and flow of internal experience by teaching children how to sit quietly and simply listen to themselves or focus, have a single pointed focus on music or a picture, and notice whatever thoughts, feelings, or body sensations emerge. That they will begin to learn to tell the difference between a sensation and an emotion, and to recognize that these internal sensations continuously shift and change, especially as they develop control over their physiological states. Oftentimes I use the description that it's like the weather in New England. It's sunny 1 minute, cloudy the next, rain the next. So it is with our physical and emotional sensations. A different goal is that we focus on a person's physical self-experience to increase their self-awareness. So as they sit and practice breathing, it helps them to pay attention to this moment in time. When I first began work in trauma, a lot of focus was on helping students to tell the story of the traumatic event, and we have moved away from that. The child is not the trauma. The child is the survivor. And that how do we give children these skills to create a physical sense of control so as to protect against re-victimization. So our responsibility in the schools and with working with children is to recognize risk factors. How can we help to help them manage situations that are maybe beyond their ability right now? Change their seat in class, offer multiple breaks during the day, make sure that they have regular physical activity, gym or recess, or some opportunity to be able to move their bodies throughout the day. Reduce what we can. Don't focus on what we can't. Just don't say, well, I wish so-and-so. Not helpful. Focus on what we can. Recognize their strengths. They are not their trauma. They are much more than that. And build on these. And so here we have reduce risk factors, promote protective factors, and we will have a resilient child. What schools can do? As I mentioned earlier, first assure they are safe now, both at home and in school. Build a relationship. Get to know them. What's their favorite ice cream? What sports do they like? What do they like to do when they have nothing that they have to do? Build a culture in the school of safety through predictable rules and clearly taught behavioral and academic expectations. We don't expect students to be able to follow the rules unless they are taught, and so we teach. Help students who are overwhelmed develop a plan, and make sure that they develop the plan with our assistance. We don't give them the plan. Increase a sense of belonging through supportive classrooms. It's important that each classroom is a little community within itself, and each school is a larger representation of that community in which all students belong. Increase their feelings of competence by building on strengths. Every child is good at something. Find out what that is and help them to develop it. And most importantly, in my opinion, is allow opportunities for play. It is important that there be time for fun, time for relaxation, time to just enjoy each other throughout the school day. And I leave you with this, that working with trauma is as much about remembering how one survived as it is about what is broken. Let's build on the strength. Let's create the resilience. Thank you.